So the last part of what we read last time, section 131, Locke tells us, or he talks about the common good, right? All of this is directed, he says, is to be directed to no other end but the peace, safety, and public good of the people. Well, what does that mean? Where does this leave us? Where are we at the beginning of chapter 10 of the second treatise? So let me sum up a little bit, and then we can maybe move forward. Hobbes had said that human beings are characterized, motivated by passion, right? Fear and desire. And the passions, Hobbes tells us, set the agenda for reason, and they actually make reason possible. And Locke doesn't disagree with that. It certainly is a contrast with the classics, right? That for the classics, the passions are things that interfere with reason. They're equally rational, but they're also not authoritative in the way that reason is. For Hobbes, the passions are authoritative. The passions give shape to your life and to your reason, for that matter. So in this sense, Hobbes agrees with Thucydides, with Thrasymachus and Machiavelli, right? That, which of course had led to the conclusion that justice is the right of the stronger, which is essentially what Hobbes proposes, right? So government recognizes the human passion, the human desire for power, and counters it with a big, massive thing, right? Government that is fearful. So a big fear contrasting with a big desire, and this is how Hobbes sees it. Locke, on the other hand, channels desire away from the desire to have what somebody else has to the desire for property. And Locke puts this, he says it's a natural principle, right? Property is natural, just as the passions are natural. So rather than a quest for domination, rather than a quest for control, Locke tones down the violence and says, here's something you can do. Here's something everybody can do, right? They can acquire property, and they're smart enough to figure it out. And every individual has the passion for property and has the reason to decide how to get it. So for Locke, right, the goal, and I think what he's talking about when he talks about the common good at the end of chapter 9, what the goal is sort of a flourishing human project, and that human project is creativity, creating the things that make it possible to achieve our desires. And this is something actually that becomes important for later figures, especially for Marx. It's extraordinary the degree to which Marx actually channels stuff that's in Locke. He just takes it in a different direction. That much I wanted to say to begin with. Let me see what else I need to say here. So we've talked about government as a production, right? Locke holds that we are in this in common, that at some level we want to be in this in common, although again, the origin of the state is not clear. But for Locke, it is clear, what is clear is that the state can only come to exist by consent, by agreement among the people. So we'll talk a little bit then about forms of a commonwealth, which is the word Hobbes, the word Locke likes. Actually, Hobbes doesn't mind it either. And a little bit about what that means. So at the beginning of chapter 10, section 132, Hobbes says, or damn it, Locke says again, he repeats this concern that he has, that at the beginning of a society, the power is in everyone, is in the corporate body. And what they do then is they agree to form a polity. And then out of that agreement, they agree on a disposition of the legislative power. Locke doesn't explicitly say one is better than the other, one is more conformable to the human soul than another, right? What he says in section 132 here is, accordingly, those of the community, and so accordingly of these, the community may make compounded and mixed forms of government as they think good. Locke is perfectly open to what a good polity would look like. Does it have to be a monarchy? No. Does it have to be an aristocracy? No. Does it have to be a democracy? No. So he's neutral on forms of government, but we'll see he's got some conditions, right? The form of government, what determines the form of government, he says, again, this is still in 132, placing the supreme power. So who's got the legislative power? That's the critical question. And that's what you have to decide, or the people have to decide at the beginning. And then he explains his use of the word commonwealth. Nothing really extraordinary about that. 134, then he goes on, right? The first and fundamental positive law of all commonwealths is the establishment of the legislative power. So where that resides, and of course in England, and this is what he's got in mind, right? In England, the legislative power is in Parliament. And so Locke is the first sort of mainstream figure in the modern world to give us an idea, a doctrine of separation of powers. And, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So legislative is the supreme power. It's the thing that grants to laws their legitimacy. And that legitimacy comes from the consent of society, as he says in section 134. Now, he puts limits on it. And again, remember, Locke is about limited government. So government is not completely powerful. What am I trying to say? Omnipotent, right? Government is not omnipotent. There are certain things that are simply out of bounds. So there are distinct limits on what government can do. And this he starts elaborating on this in 135. Because, right, we're granting power to the legislature, but we cannot grant the legislature more power than we have in ourselves. And as he has said before, a little obscurely, but it's okay. As he said before, we don't have the right to take our own life. And so we cannot convey that power to someone else, right? Now, we can commit a crime and forfeit that right, and that's a different problem. But we cannot grant that right. We cannot grant the right to kill us to the legislature or anyone else, right? The power of the legislature, this is what he says again, still in 135. Their power, in the utmost bounds of it, is limited to the public good of society. It is a power that hath no other end but preservation, and therefore can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subject. So the power of the legislature is a power to increase, to improve, to enlarge, right? All of those things. It is not a power to diminish, to make smaller, anything that's within its control. And if it does that, it's overstepping its bounds. And this, he says, is a bound that's established by the law of nature. Now, section 136 brings up a really critical point about Locke. Secondly, he says in 136, the legislative or supreme authority cannot assume to itself a power to rule by extemporary arbitrary decrees. I'm having trouble talking this morning. But is bound to dispense justice and decide the rights of the subject by promulgated standing laws and known authorized judges. We haven't really noticed it up to this point, or I haven't talked about it, but this brings up a really critical point about Locke. For the classics, and even for Machiavelli, and to some degree even for Hobbes, their concern is the substance of the law. Is it accomplishing the goals that it needs to accomplish, that nature has set for law to accomplish? Locke is not about the ends of the law, the goals of the law. Locke is about the procedures. So this is a big shift in our understanding and our thinking about what justice might be, right? So instead of, is it achieving the right purpose? It is it going about it in the right way, in the right manner? Is it using the right tools to make the choices that it makes, either sentencing or legislation or something like that? Now, of course, what this means is that there is nothing substantively unjust or illegal for Hobbes. It means that there is stuff that is procedurally problematic or procedurally illegal. And so, but, I mean, the other side of that is, when you agree to the social contract, you agree to certain procedures. And what the procedures that you've agreed to may produce different outcomes depending on exactly how people decide, how the majority decide. You agree to abide by that, whether you like the outcome or not. So it's entirely possible that you would object to some kind of law or another. I mean, taxes, for example. You might object to that. But if the majority has agreed to it, you agreed that the procedure of majority rule to bind us all about taxation or anything else is the appropriate procedure. And so you're bound by the decision that the majority makes. So this is quite a difference in Locke. And this really makes quite a change in the way that we think about what justice is. And this is one of the problems that we have looking back at at Plato and Aristotle, for example, because that's not their idea of justice at all. Their idea is, what does nature, what is the right outcome as far as nature is concerned? So it's important to see that this change is something that Locke believes is going to improve human life and is going to lead to human flourishing. So you need standing laws. That, to us, that seems obvious. But I don't know what else you can say about that, right? Stated rules. You have to, in the legal profession, they call this a reliance interest. You place your reliance that the laws are going to stay steady. And so if you buy a house or if you buy a share of stock, you accept the law, but you also assume that it's going to stay consistent, right? Because otherwise your stock or your house could wind up being of no value. And the sovereign, Locke is saying, needs to be sensitive to this, right? Needs to be concerned about this, because people do rely on the will of the sovereign. So, established laws. Third, right, Section 138, the supreme power cannot take from any man part of his property without his own consent. That seems, again, taxation without representation is tyranny, right? I mean, this is our great phrase in the United States. So this, we took this straight from Locke. And I don't know what more I could say to explain this, right? Consent is the foundation of government, not just for the foundation of it, but for the ongoing action of government, right? Consent needs to be consistently given in order to preserve natural rights. So he talks about a little bit more about absolute monarchy. I don't think we need to go into that. And government is entrusted with power, he says in 139, for this end, that men might have and secure their properties. And we saw that in chapter 9, right? This is the reason, the one massive reason why people agree to civil society, and this is the only way to make sure that it actually achieves its objectives. Right, and he talks about, again, he further elaboration on property rights, the end of 139, and further elaboration on consent in 140. It must be with his own consent, i.e. the consent of the majority, giving it either by themselves or by the representatives chosen by them. Remember that the classics had been very down on democracy, and democracy historically has not been a successful form of government. Locke, however, is in England, where England has had a sort of partial democracy for some time. And this is the fundamental condition of British government, is that Parliament has to agree to new taxes, right? So you see that he's taking the British practice and is giving it a theoretical spin here. And it works, right? It works with consent. It works with his ideas about natural rights, and so on. Rousseau, we'll deal with Rousseau at the end of next week. Rousseau is very critical of that, but we'll get there. The legislative cannot transfer its power. That's interesting, right? If you've studied constitutional law, you know that one of the concerns about the Supreme Court in the 1920s and 30s was the tendency of Congress to delegate legislative power to independent agencies or to the executive. And they took the position, there's a Latin phrase, which I won't quote to you, but basically it means delegated powers cannot be redelegated. So Congress has delegated powers from the Constitution, right? Lay and collect taxes and so forth and so forth. But it cannot then let somebody else exercise its power. And this is what Locke is talking about in section 141. Sorry. So 142 is the summary of all of this. So that's the last sentence then in chapter 11, right? The legislative neither must nor can transfer the power of making laws to anybody else or to place it anywhere but where the people have. So the Supreme Court had taken that a little bit too seriously, and it became a big problem but they resolved it. Well, they sort of resolved it. They're about to unresolve it, right? Because the Supreme Court is kind of hostile now to big government. Okay. Now, chapter 12, Locke is introducing something that we have sort of seen before, but not really. And that is separation of powers. The way separation of powers works for Locke is understood functionally, right? Different parts of the government have different functions. And so a Lockean mixed regime is not an Aristotelian mixed regime, and is probably not actually the English mixed regime either, but that's a different problem. For Aristotle, right, you have different classes in society, and those classes are fixed. Basically, it's the rich and the poor. For Locke, there are different functions inherent in government. There is a legislative function, there's an executive function. Locke doesn't talk about the judicial, he talks about the federative. So for Locke, the power of judging is part of the executive power. It's Montesquieu that adds the judicial power as a third power, and he sort of lumps Locke's federative and executive powers in together, which is what we do. Montesquieu did this because of the peculiarities of French constitutionalism, which that's a loose term, where the French had these regional bodies called parlements. It looks like parliament, only spelled differently and pronounced in French. So, and they were judicial bodies that had the responsibility to register royal decrees. So the king would make a law or issue a proclamation, a law, to be a law. And it was up to the parliaments to accept them and make them effective within the area that they control. And they could refuse, right? So Montesquieu's idea of judicial review it depends on looking at the British courts with French institutions in mind, and that's how we get to be where we are. And you ever wonder why we're mixed up? Well, that's part of the reason. So we inherited in our thinking about separation of powers, we inherited a kind of a functional blend of British and French institutions. So the important thing to see, and this again is consistent with Locke's proceduralism, in section 143, the legislative power, he says, is put into the hands of different persons who duly assembled make the laws, which when they have finished making the laws, being separated again, they are themselves subject to the laws they have made. That's justice, right? That is procedurally, that's just. That the person who makes the law should be subject to the law. That's more important in some ways than to make sure that everyone is represented in making the law. And it's the other side of you agreeing to abide by laws that are made by the procedures that you've established, whatever the substance of the law is, right? It's a check. It's a check on arbitrariness. It's a check on people making laws that apply to you, but not to them. This is a key when we want to understand the justice of American law, right? Think about American law in the segregation era, in the Jim Crow era, or think about American law under slavery, right? There was a classic instance of laws being made that apply to some people, but not to the ones that are making them. So you apply one set of laws to African Americans and another set of laws to white Americans, and you don't let African Americans interfere in making them or changing them, right? Martin Luther King seized on this as a principle of justice and drove it home, right? It is just that those who make the law should live under the law. That procedurally is a guarantee of the law's reasonableness, of the law's equity, that's more powerful than a guarantee of voting rights or something like that. Not that you shouldn't have voting rights, but it's a powerful check. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so the legislative power is central. And the legislative power, okay. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So the legislative is one, the executive is another, right? So they come to be separated because you don't need to have the legislative power in being all the time, but you do need to have an executive power. You do need to have the police available wherever wherever there's trouble, or you need to have customs officers in the port when the ship comes in, or something like that. So you need people to execute the laws on an ongoing basis. And so this is functionally, this is the difference, or this is a difference between the legislative and the judicial, and the legislative and the executive. Okay. And then this third power, right, the prerogative power, is basically the foreign policy power. How do you make alliances? How do you make treaties? How do you handle commercial relations with other countries, and so forth and so on? So this is, you can see that there might be two distinct roles for an executive, domestic and foreign. So war and peace and all of that stuff. But as Locke points out, it's harder to direct all of this executive power by standing laws. There's a lot of discretion involved. There's a lot of adjustment involved. And especially in foreign policy, you kind of have to be, well, you have to be subtle. You have to be indirect. And you can't always set the terms of a transaction that you might want to have. So you have to be prepared to be flexible. Okay. Chapter 13, somebody asked yesterday about fiduciary powers. And here it is in 149, in the middle of that first paragraph, a few lines down the first paragraph, right? The legislative being only a fiduciary power to act for certain ends, there remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative when they find the legislative acts contrary to the trust reposed in them. You have the right, ongoing right to revolution. You have the right to sit in judgment and say, is this legislative body doing what we asked it to do? Is it going beyond its bounds? Is it doing less than it should? And if so, you have the right to change it. And so the right of revolution, which he'll talk about later on, that's the end of the book, but the right of revolution is not something that you give up. Hobbes, of course, had said, you absolutely give it up, right? Once you agree to a sovereign, that's it. And sorry. Locke is like, no, it's a fiduciary power. It is a trustee for the power that you have given it. And as a trustee, it is responsible to you to make sure that it is doing it safely and successfully. And so you have the responsibility to hold them to that. As he says later on, thus the community perpetually retains a supreme power of saving themselves from the attempts and designs of anybody, even of their legislators, whenever they shall be so foolish or so wicked as to lay and carry designs and carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject. So it doesn't go away. You have a responsibility to look over your legislator's shoulders and to say, I don't think you're doing a good job. And thus, he says, this is the end of 149, thus the community may be said in this respect to be always the supreme power, but not as considered under any form of government, because this power of the people can never take place till the government be dissolved. So there's two different things, right? There's the government and there's the society. And for Locke, society, in this sense, Locke probably does agree with Hobbes, right? Society is something that's always in being. Governments can come and go. And as long as you you can keep government in check, society is something that sort of has an organic existence that doesn't go out of being. So government you can check, society you can't. And so while government subsists, the legislative is the supreme law. Allegiance goes to the monarch. In the United States, we swear to uphold, preserve, protect, and defend, as they say, the Constitution of the United States. So our oaths are not to the sovereign, the monarch as a sovereign power, but rather to the Constitution as the work of the sovereign people of the United States. But bear in mind that for Locke too, if you swear an oath to the king, that is not an oath to the society, right? That is an oath simply to the head of the government. Okay. And a lot of this, what follows in chapter 13 is particular to Britain, right? And really applies to the exclusion controversy, right? Whether they were going to exclude James II from the throne, which they didn't do ultimately, although they kicked him out. I mean, they didn't exclude him in advance, right? So, I don't know that there's much to say about that necessarily. Right. So it had to, a lot of this has to do, as he says in 156. There was a controversy about who could call a new parliament and when to call a new parliament. Ultimately, Parliament did pass a law that required parliaments to last 7 years and to be called into session at particular times. At the time that Locke was writing, the king can decide just to rule without parliament for a period of time. So he says, this is something that's been trusted to the executive's discretion. In 156, right? Supposing the regulation of times for the assembling and sitting of the legislative not settled by the original Constitution, it naturally fell into the hands of the executive. So he could decide, or she could decide whether to call a parliament or not. Um, yeah. So 157, Locke is complaining about something that's going to be complained about all the way until 1832, and that is rotten boroughs, right? And these boroughs that have two people living in them, who then return a member to parliament, right? So the way that the system is kind of skewed in the direction of the aristocracy. Um, Starting in 158, chapter 14 in some ways starts with 158 and not with 159. He starts talking about prerogative. Prerogative is very interesting, although it's not complicated, I don't think. Where is it? As he says at 160, right, the power to act according to discretion for the public good without the prescription of the law, and sometimes even against it, is that which is called prerogative. The dispute, there is a constant dispute in the United States over whether the president has prerogative power. Nixon, for example, said, whenever the president does it, it's not illegal. Well, that was kind of an assertion of a presidential power of prerogative that is arguably, well, it's arguable, right? Does the president have it or not? For Locke, it's clear the king does have it, right? And that when the safety of the people, on 158, Salus Populi Suprema Lex, right? The safety of the people is supreme law. The executive power has the authority to go against the law if the safety of the people should require it. That's the point of prerogative. It's this kind of backstop. If all else fails, you allow the executive to use prerogative power and get things done, right? Get the ventilators or whatever else it is. So Locke says, look, you can't limit prerogative, but you also can't encroach on it. That prerogative is subject to limits that the legislature might put. But it's also not subject to kind of legal regulation. So Locke is all about procedures, except when there's an extreme need, an extreme circumstance that calls for the assertion of prerogative power. And so this is kind of an exception, kind of an out for Locke's proceduralism. But I think he sees it as a necessary sort of safety valve. And as he points out in 165, if you look at the history of England, prerogative has always increased when good and wise princes were occupying the throne. And this is a problem, a perpetual problem of government, right? That good monarchs are the ones that encroach on people's liberties, encroach on property, and we're happy to do it. Yeah, sure, come on, rule us, right? You make the decisions. You're good at it. Go right ahead. And then, of course, for every Lincoln, you get an Andrew Johnson, who you wouldn't trust with a 10-foot pole. And so, or I don't know if trust with it, you understand what I'm trying to say here. You wouldn't trust Andrew Johnson farther than you could throw it. And then you have to figure out how to reel it back, right? How this prerogative that you've created, what are you going to do to call it back? And this is on 166, he sums it up, right? Upon this is founded the saying that the reigns of good princes have always been most dangerous to the liberties of the people. right? We trusted Dwight Eisenhower, and so he built a surveillance state that is really pretty intrusive and pretty extensive. We trusted JFK to run it. We didn't trust Johnson, and so we tried in long after he was gone, of course. We tried to rein it in somewhat, but it's a big question whether it worked or not. Okay, so how do you cut off a bad use of the prerogative? Locke says, well, there's really no way to do that. There's an appeal to heaven, and you can think of that in a number of ways. It might be prayer, or it might be warfare. And Locke is not, once you've established a government, it doesn't mean warfare is out of the picture. It just means it's not the first resort, but it might be the last resort. Locke sort of in chapter 15, then, Locke considers three different kinds of power, and he's kind of summing up what his doctrine is with regard to power. So you've got paternal power, you've got despotic power, and in the middle, you've got political power. So you've got the two extremes. Paternal power is good. It's what parents do to help their children grow. Despotic power is absolute power over a person's life and liberty. It's a state of war continued. And then political power is what we give up when we join civil society. We give it up to the legislator, we give it up to the executive. It's a trust. And its design, right? We trust institutions. This is section 171. No other end or measure when in the hands of the magistrate, but to preserve the members of that society in their lives, liberties, and possessions, and so cannot be an absolute arbitrary power over their lives and fortunes, right? Life, liberty, and property. That's where it comes from. And that's the point of government, is to preserve these things. And anything else is illegitimate. Now, that's a pretty wide authority, right? But it cannot be despotic. It cannot be used to take away any of those things without your consent. And it probably can't be used to take your life even with your consent. And this is at 173, right? Nature gives us the first of these, paternal power. Voluntary agreement gives us political power. And forfeiture gives us despotic power. So those are the three origins of these three different powers, and they have to be exercised in different ways. But political power, the central one, the good one, the right one, is the one that we have agreed to give up certain rights, and because we've agreed to give them up, or rather in agreeing to give them up, we've agreed to monitor how that authority is used. And so that's for Locke, and again, for the American founders, that is the way that we come to understand just exactly what good government is. Okay, don't forget to skip chapter 16, and we will begin with chapter 17 shortly, Monday. Okay, bye.